Travis McMichael and Gregory McMichael. On February 23, 2020, a 25-year-old man named Ahmaud Arbery went for a jog through the Satilla Shores neighborhood outside Brunswick, Georgia. He had no weapon on him. He had no criminal intent. He was wearing shorts and running shoes, doing what he had done dozens of times before, running through a quiet residential street in broad daylight. Within minutes, two men in a pickup truck were chasing him down. A neighbor in a second truck joined the pursuit and started filming on his cell phone. And roughly 5 minutes after that chase began, Ahmaud Arbery was lying face down on the pavement, shot 3 times with a 12-gauge shotgun while the camera was still rolling. The men who killed him drove home that afternoon. Police came to the scene, took statements, and left. There were no arrests, no charges, and no indication that anyone would be held accountable. For more than 2 months, the men who chased down and shot Ahmaud Arbery in the middle of a public road walked free because the local district attorney decided there was not enough evidence to prosecute. That video sat unseen for 74 days. When it finally leaked to the public in May of 2020, the entire country watched a man die on camera. The outrage was immediate and it was massive. Gregory McMichael was 64 years old and a retired investigator who had spent decades working for the Brunswick District Attorney's Office. He knew the local justice system inside and out. His son, Travis McMichael, was 34, a former U.S. Coast Guard mechanic. They lived together in Satilla Shores, and on that February afternoon, Gregory spotted Arbery jogging past the house. He told investigators later that he believed Arbery matched the description of someone seen on surveillance camera at a nearby construction site. He grabbed a .357 Magnum revolver and yelled for Travis to get the shotgun. They jumped into their white pickup truck and gave chase. Their neighbor, William Bryan, 50 years old, saw the commotion, got into his own truck, and joined the pursuit from behind. He effectively boxed Arbery in while recording the entire thing on his phone. The chase covered several blocks. At one point, Arbery tried to run around the truck to escape. Travis McMichael stepped out with the Remington .870 shotgun, and during a brief physical struggle at close range, he fired 3 times. Arbery collapsed in the road and died at the scene. What followed was a local cover-up that nearly succeeded. The first prosecutor assigned to the case, George Barnhill, wrote a memo recommending no charges. He argued the McMichaels were acting lawfully under Georgia's citizen's arrest statute. What he failed to disclose was that Gregory McMichael had worked directly in his office. A second prosecutor also recused herself due to conflicts. It was not until the Georgia Bureau of Investigation took jurisdiction on May 5, 2020, just 2 days after the video went viral, that Travis and Gregory McMichael were finally arrested and charged with murder. The state trial took place in Glynn County Superior Court before Judge Timothy Walmsley. During jury selection, defense attorneys used peremptory strikes to remove nearly every black juror from the pool. The final panel seated just 1 black juror out of 12. Walmsley noted on the record that there appeared to be intentional discrimination in the jury selection process, but he allowed the trial to go forward. On November 24, 2021, the jury convicted all 3 defendants of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and criminal attempt to commit false imprisonment. Before sentencing, Judge Walmsley held 1 full minute of silence in the courtroom. He told those present that the single minute represented a fraction of the time Ahmaud Arbery had spent running through Satilla Shores in terror, and that he kept returning to the fear that must have consumed that young man during those final minutes of his life. He sentenced Travis and Gregory McMichael to life without the possibility of parole. Brian received life with parole eligibility after 30 years. But the case did not end there. 3 months later, in February of 2022, a federal jury convicted all 3 men of hate crimes and attempted kidnapping. FBI intelligence analyst Amy Vaughn walked the jury through more than 24 racist text messages and social media conversations that Travis McMichael and William Bryan had engaged in over the months and years before the killing. Federal prosecutor Christopher Paris told the jury that the evidence confirmed what millions of people had felt in their hearts the moment they watched the video, that this would never have happened if Ahmaud Arbery had been white. On August 8, 2022, Judge Lisa Godbey Wood imposed the federal sentences. Life plus 10 years for Travis. Life plus 7 years for Gregory. 35 years for Brian. All to be served in state prison, as the Arbery family had requested. Wood addressed the courtroom and said simply that a young man was dead, that Ahmaud Arbery would be forever 25, and that a jury had found it happened because he was black. Prosecutor Tara Lyons called the sentencing the end of at least one chapter in an excruciatingly painful journey for Ahmaud Arbery's family, for his community, and for an entire nation that had wept for him. Gregory McMichael addressed the family and said there had been no malice in his heart or his son's heart that day. Travis declined to speak. Brian said he never intended any harm and would never have played any role in what happened if he had known then what he knows now. Marcus Arbery, Ahmaud's father, told the court that these 3 men had broken his heart into pieces that could never be found or repaired. As of 2023, Travis McMichael is held at Hayes State Prison in Tryon, Georgia, where he has been in protective custody lockdown since January of that year. He is confined to a 10 by 8 foot cell due to ongoing death threats. His father, Gregory, was transferred to Augusta State Medical Prison after suffering health complications, including a stroke. He is 67 years old. Brian is at Valdosta State Prison. In November of 2025, the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals denied all 3 federal conviction appeals. None of them are getting out, and the McMichaels are not even close to the most violent names housed within the Georgia prison system. The case that comes next involved 8 people found dead inside a single trailer, and the man who called 911 to report the massacre was the one who committed it. Guy Heinze, Jr. In the early hours of August 29, 2009, a 911 call came in from a mobile home park north of Brunswick, Georgia. The caller was hysterical. He was screaming into the phone that his whole family was dead. When deputies from the Glynn County Sheriff's Office arrived at the New Hope Mobile Home Park at 5410 U.S. Route 17, they walked into something none of them had ever seen before. Inside a single double-wide trailer, 8 members of an extended family had been beaten to death. Blood was everywhere. The walls, the floors, the bedding. Every room told the same story. Blunt force devastation, carried out while the victims slept. The dead included Guy Heinze Sr., 45, Rusty Toller Sr., 44, Brenda Gale Falligan, 49, Russell Toller Jr., 20, Chrissy Toller, 22, Michael Toller, 19, Michelle Toller, just 15 years old, and Joseph West, 30, Chrissy's boyfriend. A 3-year-old boy, Byron Jimerson Jr., Chrissy's son, was the only person found alive in that trailer. He had suffered catastrophic head injuries, but was somehow still breathing. Autopsies documented more than 220 combined wounds across the 8 victims. Every single one of them died of skull and brain injuries caused by repeated blunt force blows. Investigators determined the weapon was likely a shotgun barrel. A broken shotgun stock was found near Rusty Toller Sr.'s head. The murder weapon itself was never recovered. The man who had made that 911 call, the one screaming that his family was gone, was Guy William Heinze Jr. He was 22 years old. He was Guy Heinze Sr.'s son, and he had been living in that same trailer with his extended family. He told dispatchers he had come home and found the bodies. He was distraught. He was frantic. And 6 days later, he was in handcuffs. The initial charges were evidence tampering and drug possession. Investigators had already noticed inconsistencies in his story, and the physical evidence was piling up fast. Investigators found Michelle Toller's blood-covered cell phone inside Heinze's car. They recovered a shotgun with Heinze's bloody palm print on the stock, though forensic analysis ruled that specific gun out as the murder weapon. The prosecution built its theory around what they believed had triggered the rampage. According to the state, Heinze had been smoking crack that night and got into a confrontation with Rusty Toller Sr. in a closet over a bottle of prescription painkillers. The fight escalated. Heinze killed Toller and then moved through the trailer, killing everyone else to eliminate witnesses. And somehow, it gets worse. 8 people, including a 15-year-old girl, bludgeoned to death in their sleep. The only survivor was a toddler left with injuries that would affect him for the rest of his life. All of it inside one trailer, in one night, allegedly by one man. The trial did not begin until 2013, more than 4 years after the murders. The state initially sought the death penalty. Prosecutors indicted Heinze on September 14, 2009, and the case went before Glynn County Superior Court Judge Stephen Scarlett. Lead prosecutor John B. Johnson told the jury in his closing argument that Heinze went through the house that night, angry and out of control, and killed them all. The defense pushed back hard. Lead counsel Newell Hamilton Jr. argued that it was physically impossible for a single person to have inflicted that many wounds on 8 people without at least one of them escaping or fighting back effectively. He brought in forensic experts who testified that the attack pattern was consistent with 3 to 5 assailants, not one. The defense also pointed to unidentified bloody fingerprints found at the scene that had never been matched to Heinze or anyone else. No DNA evidence conclusively placed the murder weapon in Heinze's hands. The prosecution's case, the defense argued, was built on circumstance and theory, not on direct evidence of who swung the weapon. Despite all of that, the jury was not persuaded. After one juror was dismissed during deliberations, the state agreed to take the death penalty off the table in exchange for proceeding with the remaining panel. On October 31, 2013, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 8 counts of malice murder. Judge Scarlett sentenced Guy Heinze Jr. to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Heinze's younger brother Tyler erupted in the courtroom, shouting that it was not justice and that the system had heard what it wanted to hear. In December of 2020, the Georgia Supreme Court unanimously upheld all 8 convictions. Heinze has since filed motions citing 11 alleged trial errors, including the destruction of key evidence. None have succeeded. His defense team has continued to argue that the investigation was compromised from the start, pointing to evidence that was mishandled or lost before trial, and to bloody prints at the scene that were never identified. Whether those arguments will ever gain traction in a future appeal remains to be seen. But as of now, every court that has reviewed this case has reached the same conclusion. Guy Heinze Jr. is currently housed at Valdosta State Prison in Georgia. He will spend the rest of his life there. His case remains one of the deadliest single-location mass murders in the state's history, and the sheer scale of it, 8 people killed in one trailer in one night, still defies easy comprehension. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. But the next case on this list is not about a single night of violence. It is about a man whose influence spread to thousands of followers through social media and the trail of destruction that followed everywhere his teachings took hold. Rashad Jamal White. Cult leaders have always relied on isolation. Find a compound, cut off contact with the outside world, build a reality that only exists behind closed doors. Rashad Jamal White skipped all of that. He built his following from a phone screen. Operating under the name Rashad Jamal and the online alias Divine Insight, White built a following called the University of Cosmic Intelligence, or UCI, that grew to hundreds of thousands of followers across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. His content blended Black and Indigenous identity claims with polygamy advocacy, sovereign citizen ideology, anti-vaccination rhetoric, and the repeated assertion that he was a god sent to heal the planet. His videos were polished, his delivery was confident, and his audience was enormous. White was originally from Chicago and raised in Stone Mountain, Georgia. He presented himself as a spiritual leader and healer. What his followers did not know, or chose to ignore, was that he had been building a criminal record for years before any of them ever hit the follow button. He had prior domestic battery convictions in Wisconsin. In 2018, he was charged with strangulation and suffocation in a domestic abuse case. He had also been charged with murder at one point, though he was never convicted on that charge. If White had stopped there, this would be a very different story. In 2022, a grand jury in Barrow County, Georgia, indicted him on 2 counts of child molestation and 1 count of cruelty to children. The victim was 10 years old, the daughter of his former partner, Darshall Smith, with whom White shared a son. A judge denied bond after finding that White was both a flight risk and a direct danger to the community. Because the victim is a minor, the specifics of what was described in court filings will not be detailed here. What the investigation uncovered was described in those filings as deliberate and premeditated. The scope of the harm documented across multiple hearings was extensive. In August of 2023, a Barrow County jury convicted White of 1 count of child molestation and 1 count of cruelty to children. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in prison, followed by 22 years of probation. White denied every charge, calling his prosecution the work of a racist county trying to silence his message. He showed no remorse in the courtroom, and his supporters outside continued to amplify his claims of persecution on social media. The conviction did nothing to shake the loyalty of his most devoted followers. If anything, it made some of them more radicalized, more convinced that their leader was being targeted for speaking the truth. And that is where this case goes from disturbing to something much darker. White's influence did not stop at his own criminal conduct. His teachings followed his followers out into the real world, and the results were catastrophic. In January of 2022, a UCI follower named Damian Washam killed his own mother with a sword in 8 Mile, Alabama. He was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity, but the connection to White's teachings was documented. 7 months later, in August of 2022, 2 UCI followers, Crystal Pinkins and Yasmin Hyder, ambushed and shot a 22-year-old University of Central Florida student named Adam Simji at Chiaha State Park in Alabama. Simji was on a hike with his girlfriend when the 2 women confronted them on the trail. What should have been a quiet afternoon in a state park turned into a roadside execution. Simji was killed at the scene. His girlfriend survived. Hyder was later sentenced to 35 years in prison. Pinkins received a life sentence in January of 2024. Investigators linked both women directly to White's UCI movement and found evidence that they had been living in an off-grid encampment connected to the group. Then, in August of 2023, Berkeley, Missouri police linked White's teachings to the disappearance of 6 adults and children from a rental home in St. Louis County. The department's Major Steve Rung released a public statement confirming the investigation had revealed that the missing individuals had become part of a spiritual cult following White's teachings, and noted that White himself was already convicted and serving a lengthy prison sentence in Georgia. That's not a typo, by the way. A man sitting in a Georgia prison cell, convicted of crimes against a child, still had followers willing to commit murder, willing to vanish with their children, willing to destroy their own families in devotion to his teachings. White is currently serving his sentence in Georgia Department of Corrections custody. The specific facility has not been confirmed in public reporting. He has continued giving phone interviews from prison, maintaining his innocence and his status as a spiritual authority. But while White's violence spread outward through an army of believers, the next man on this list required no followers and no ideology. He just needed proximity. And inside the walls of Hays State Prison, he found exactly that. Daniel Luke Ferguson. On Christmas night, 2012, inside a cell at Hays State Prison in Tryon, Georgia, an inmate named Damian McLean was strangled to death by the man assigned to share his cell. McLean was 27 years old, serving time on 2 armed robbery convictions. He was not considered a high-risk inmate. He was not in protective custody. He was simply placed in a cell with the wrong person. His killer was Daniel Luke Ferguson, a man who by that point had already taken 1 life and nearly taken a second, and who would go on to kill again after leaving Hays. 3 murders and 1 near-fatal attack across 3 different Georgia facilities. Ferguson is, by any measure, one of the most violent inmates in the history of the state's correction system. Ferguson was from Monroe, in Walton County. On January 28, 2008, when he was just 17 years old, he shot and killed his 94-year-old neighbor Tom Daniel on Jacks Creek Road. At 18, he pleaded guilty to murder, aggravated assault, burglary, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The judge handed down a life sentence plus consecutive 10-year and 5-year terms. Ferguson would never see the outside of a prison again. That did not make anyone inside the prison any safer. While housed at Georgia State Prison, Ferguson attacked an inmate named Travis Boyd, slashing his throat with enough force that Boyd had to be airlifted from the facility. Boyd survived, barely, but the wound came within inches of being fatal. He later wrote a letter saying he did not even know Ferguson, had never spoken to him, and could not understand why it happened. There was no argument. There was no dispute. There was no prior conflict of any kind. Ferguson simply selected a target and attacked. That pattern, violence without provocation, without reason, without warning, would define every act of brutality that followed. Then he was transferred to Hays State Prison. On December 25, 2012, Ferguson strangled Damian McLean in their shared cell. The killing happened during what became one of the most violent stretches in the history of any Georgia state prison. In an 8-week span starting December 19th, 4 Hays inmates were murdered. Derek Stubbs was killed on December 19th, while housed in protective custody, the unit specifically designed to keep vulnerable inmates safe. McLean was killed on Christmas night. Nathaniel Reynolds was killed on January 18th, 2013. Pippa Hall Jackson was killed on February 5th. During that same period, even while the facility was under full lockdown, 2 correctional officers were stabbed in late January. A third officer was stabbed 22 times in February. 7 months earlier, in May of 2012, a CERT officer had been stabbed twice in the face. An audit conducted in September of 2012, just 3 months before the killing spree began, found that 42% of the cell door locks at Hayes either did not function at all or could be easily defeated by inmates. 42%. The Southern Center for Human Rights reported that prisoners routinely slept in cells they were not assigned to and moved freely, undetected, across the prison campus. Inmates were effectively living in a facility with no functioning security infrastructure. The audit was on record. The numbers were documented. And the state did not fix the problem before the killings started. To put it plainly, Hayes State Prison was operating with nearly half of its locks broken while housing some of the most dangerous men in the Georgia system. The administration had the data, they had the warnings, and 4 people died because the repairs did not happen in time. McLean's family sued, and the federal case, filed in the Northern District of Georgia, was settled on November 11, 2014, for $350,000. But Ferguson was not finished. On May 2, 2020, he was housed at Augusta State Medical Prison. Officers placed him in a cell with Eddie Gosier, a 39-year-old physically handicapped inmate. Within hours, Ferguson strangled Gosier with a bedsheet. On January 9, 2023, in Columbia County Superior Court, Ferguson pleaded guilty and received another life sentence, this one with parole eligibility after 30 years. 3 men dead. 1 survivor airlifted out with a slashed throat. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution investigated Ferguson's case and described him simply as an inmate with nothing to lose. And no, I'm not making that up. He killed a 94-year-old neighbor at 17, slashed a stranger's throat in prison, strangled his cellmate on Christmas, and then killed a handicapped man hours after being placed in his cell. Ferguson is currently held in a special management unit, the most restrictive housing classification the Georgia Department of Corrections operates. The question is not whether Daniel Luke Ferguson is dangerous. The question is how many times the system placed other human beings directly in his path. But the final case in this half of the list is different from everyone that came before it. It is not about an inmate who committed violence inside prison walls. It is about an inmate who died inside them and the people who were paid to keep him alive. Thomas Henry Giles. On October 28, 2020, a 31-year-old inmate named Thomas Henry Giles set his mattress on fire inside his cell at Augusta State Medical Prison. He was not trying to escape. He was not trying to hurt anyone. He had been classified as Level 4 mental health, the highest designation in the Georgia corrections system, and he was housed in Lockdown Unit 11B. That afternoon, he had asked to meet with his counselor. The request was denied. So Giles lit his mattress on fire, the only form of protest available to a man locked inside a concrete room with no voice and no advocate. 2 correctional officers assigned to supervise his unit watched him do it. They saw the flames. They saw the smoke filling the cell. And then, while every other prisoner in the dorm was evacuated to safety, Thomas Giles was left inside. The food tray flap on his cell door was bolted shut. The cell remained locked. For more than 3 hours, Giles sat in a sealed room filling with smoke. Soot smears found on the inside of the cell door showed where he had pressed his hands, already black with residue, against the metal, trying to get someone's attention, trying to signal that he was still in there, that he was dying. Nobody came. Thomas Henry Giles died of inhalation of products of combustion, smoke inhalation, in a locked cell. while two officers whose job it was to monitor him stood on the other side of the door. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's medical examiner did not rule this death an accident. The ruling was not suicide. The official cause of death was homicide, based on the Georgia Department of Corrections' own internal finding of what they described as the delay and negligence of the officers responsible for removing him from the cell. And somehow, it gets worse. Despite the homicide ruling, no correctional officers were ever criminally charged. Not one. Giles was not a predator. He was not on a list of Georgia's most dangerous offenders. He was a mentally ill man in the middle of a crisis who set a fire because nobody would listen to him. He needed intervention. He needed a counselor, which is exactly what he had asked for earlier that same day. Instead, the officers assigned to his unit made a decision. They evacuated the dorm around him. They sealed his cell with him still inside. And they waited while the smoke did the rest. The broader context makes the negligence even harder to stomach. Augusta State Medical Prison is classified as a medical facility. It is specifically designated to house inmates with serious physical and mental health conditions. The entire purpose of the institution is to provide a higher standard of care than a general population prison. Thomas Giles was placed there because his mental health classification required it. He was supposed to be in the one facility in the state system most equipped to handle a psychiatric crisis. And when that crisis arrived, the response was to lock the door and walk away. The former warden at Augusta, Edward Philbin, acknowledged in a September 2023 deposition that the situation had been mishandled from the start. He stated that a cell fire should have immediately triggered multiple emergency responses, beginning with getting the inmate out of the cell, and that the basic protocols were never followed. His testimony made clear that this was not a case of officers following procedure and getting an unlucky outcome. The procedure existed. They simply did not follow it. Giles's family sued the state of Georgia. In November of 2023, the state agreed to a $5 million settlement. According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, it was the largest amount ever paid to settle a claim against Georgia over the death or injury of a state prison inmate. $5 million. That is how badly the state failed Thomas Giles. His case does not fit neatly into a list about violent inmates, because Giles was not a violent inmate. He was a victim of the system that was supposed to manage his care. His story belongs in this conversation precisely because it reveals what these facilities are capable of when no one is watching. The violence inside Georgia's prison walls does not always come from the people wearing jumpsuits. Sometimes it comes from the people holding the keys. Thomas Giles was 31 years old. He had a family that fought for 3 years to hold the state accountable for his death. The $5 million settlement they received was the largest in Georgia's history for an inmate death claim. And still, not a single person has faced criminal charges for leaving a man to die in a smoke-filled cell for 3 hours. The money was paid. The warden testified. The ruling said homicide, and then the system moved on, as if Thomas Giles had never existed at all. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a good time. It helps grow this channel, and there are more cases to come. Amen Presley. Between September and December of 2014, 4 people were shot to death across the metro Atlanta area with the same .45 caliber revolver. 3 of them were homeless men, killed in their sleep. The 4th was a hairstylist walking to her car after dinner. The killings stretched across 2 counties, hit 3 different neighborhoods, and for 10 straight weeks, nobody connected them. Calvin Lewis Golston was the first. He was 53 years old, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and living on the streets of Stone Mountain in DeKalb County. On September 26, 2014, someone walked up to the strip mall where Golston had been sleeping outside and shot him to death. There was no struggle. There was no robbery. There was no confrontation of any kind. He was unconscious when he was killed, and there was nothing on his body worth taking. The case was assigned to DeKalb County homicide investigators, but without witnesses, without surveillance, and without a clear motive, it went nowhere. A homeless man with schizophrenia shot outside a strip mall. It barely made the local news cycle. 2 months passed. Then, on November 23rd, Dorian Jenkins was found dead in downtown Atlanta, shot 5 times in the chest while sleeping wrapped in blankets at the intersection of Cortlandt Street and Ralph McGill Boulevard. Jenkins was 42 years old and homeless. He had been sleeping out in the open because he had nowhere else to go. 3 days after that, on November 26th, Tommy Mims was shot 7 times while sleeping near a recycling center on Whitehall Street, also in downtown Atlanta. Mims was 68. He had survived decades on the streets only to be killed by a stranger who walked up on him in the middle of the night. Now investigators in 2 jurisdictions had a pattern they could not ignore. 3 homeless men shot in their sleep across DeKalb and Fulton counties within 10 weeks. Ballistics confirmed the same .45 caliber revolver in every case. But before a joint task force could fully organize, the killer changed targets. On December 6, 2014, Karen Pierce, a 44-year-old hairstylist from Smyrna, was walking to her car in downtown Decatur after having dinner out. Someone approached her on the street, robbed her, and shot her. Pierce was not homeless. She was not sleeping outside. She was a working woman heading to her car after a meal, and she was killed for whatever was in her purse. Ballistics matched. The same .45 caliber revolver. 4 victims in 10 weeks, and the only thing connecting them was the gun. 5 days later, on December 11th, MARTA Transit Police stopped a man at an Atlanta station for fare evasion. During the stop, officers recovered a loaded .45 caliber revolver and 32 rounds of ammunition from his person. The gun was tested. It was a ballistic match to all 4 murders. The man's name was Omen Lovell Presley. He was 34 years old, born in Chicago, raised in Stone Mountain, Georgia. He had no prior murder convictions. A man who had evaded law enforcement across 2 counties and 4 killings for 10 consecutive weeks was caught because he did not pay for a train ticket. That is the margin between a serial killer still hunting and a serial killer behind bars. Presley's method was predatory and deliberate. He would position himself near Georgia Baptist Hospital and Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, areas frequented by people living on the streets. He would wait for a vulnerable target, approach them in isolated spots, and kill them. The 3 homeless men were asleep when they were shot. They never had a chance to defend themselves or run. Pierce was the outlier, targeted during a street robbery in a more populated area, which is likely what accelerated the investigation. On June 13, 2016, Presley pleaded guilty in DeKalb County Superior Court to the murders of Calvin Golston and Karen Pierce. The court imposed 2 consecutive life without parole sentences, plus 10 years. DeKalb County District Attorney Robert James addressed the courtroom and said that Presley's actions were monstrous and had brought severe consequences on the lives of several individuals, and that when a person commits crimes that terrible, he deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. Karen Pierce's friend of 16 years, John Bullock, told the court that the world was a smaller place without Karen in it. In January of 2017, Presley returned to court in Fulton County, where he pleaded guilty to the murders of Dorian Jenkins and Tommy Mims and received an additional life sentence. During that hearing, Presley told the judge he had been helping the homeless man he killed. To rephrase that so it is perfectly clear, a man who shot a sleeping homeless person 5 times in the chest stood in a courtroom and called it assistance. Amon Presley is serving multiple consecutive life without parole sentences in Georgia Department of Corrections custody. He will die in prison. His 4 victims, Calvin Golston, Dorian Jenkins, Tommy Mims, and Karen Pierce, were killed across 10 weeks in 2014, and the only reason the killing stopped is that a transit cop noticed a man jumping a turnstile. But Presley operated in the dark. He killed while people slept, in places where nobody was watching. The next man on this list committed his crimes in the middle of a government building, in broad daylight, with the whole city of Atlanta watching in real time. Brian Nichols. On the morning of March 11, 2005, a defendant being walked into a Fulton County courtroom for his rape retrial overpowered a 5-foot-tall sheriff's deputy, beat her into a coma, took her service weapon, and walked across a sky bridge into a judge's courtroom where he opened fire. Over the next 26 hours, Brian Gene Nichols killed 4 people, carjacked multiple vehicles, took a woman hostage in her own apartment, and triggered the largest manhunt in Atlanta's modern history. He was 33 years old, and the carnage began inside one of the most secure government buildings in the state of Georgia. Nichols had been arrested in 2004 after his former girlfriend accused him of rape. His first trial ended in a hung jury. The retrial was set for March 11th. That morning, while changing clothes in a holding area adjacent to the courtroom, Nichols attacked Sheriff's Deputy Cynthia Hall. Hall stood 5 feet tall and was assigned to escort Nichols alone. He beat her so severely she was left in a coma, took her Glock service pistol, and took the key to the gun lock box. What came next happened fast. He crossed the Sky Bridge, encountered and held at gunpoint case managers Susan Christie and Gina Clark Thomas, along with attorney David Allman, and then walked into the 8th-floor courtroom of Superior Court Judge Roland Barnes. Judge Barnes was 64 years old. He was sitting on the bench when Nichols shot him in the back of the head. Nichols then turned the gun on Julie Ann Brandow, the court reporter. Both were killed in the courtroom. The building that was supposed to protect them became the place where they died. Nichols fled through the courthouse, and outside on the street, Sergeant Hoyt Teasley, a Fulton County deputy who had chased him on foot, was shot and killed. 3 dead inside or immediately outside a government courthouse during business hours. Courthouse security logs would later reveal that during his first trial, officers had found homemade shanks hidden in Nichols's shoes. The warning signs had been there. The system did not act on them. Nichols then carjacked several vehicles and vanished into Atlanta. That night, in the Buckhead neighborhood, he broke into a house being renovated by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Special Agent David Wilhelm. Wilhelm was 34 years old. Nichols shot him to death, then took his badge, his firearm, and his pickup truck. 4 people were now dead, and the city was locked down. Schools were closed. Neighborhoods were sealed off. For a full day and night, Atlanta was in a state of siege. Nichols was finally captured on March 12th, approximately 26 hours after the first shooting. He had forced his way into the Duluth apartment of a woman named Ashley Smith Robinson and held her hostage for roughly 7 hours. During that time, Smith read to him from a book called The Purpose-Driven Life and gradually persuaded him to let her leave. She walked out, called 911, and Nichols surrendered without further violence. A Fulton County grand jury indicted Nichols on 54 counts on May 5, 2005, covering murder, felony murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, aggravated assault, carjacking, and escape. District Attorney Paul Howard sought the death penalty. After repeated delays and a change of venue ordered by Judge James Botiford, who stated that fundamental fairness required a different location, the trial began on September 22, 2008, more than 3 years after the shootings. Nichols entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming he believed he was a slave rebelling against his masters. Prosecutors played a recorded video confession in which Nichols described each killing in calm, measured detail. Prosecutor Clint Rucker told the jury that Nichols was conniving, cold-blooded, vicious, remorseless, and extremely dangerous, and that if given the chance, he would do it again. On November 7, 2008, the jury convicted him on all 54 counts after roughly 12 hours of deliberation. Then came the sentencing phase, and the jury deadlocked. 9 voted for death. 3 did not. Georgia law requires a unanimous verdict for a death sentence. So Nichols received an automatic sentence of life without parole. On December 13, 2008, Judge Botiford imposed multiple consecutive life without parole terms, plus hundreds of additional years on lesser counts. He told Nichols directly that if there was any more he could give, he would. Nichols spoke briefly. He told the courtroom he understood that the things he had done had caused a great deal of pain, that he was sorry, and that he would not bring dishonor to the decision to spare his life. The case was the most expensive death penalty prosecution in Georgia history. Defense costs alone exceeded $3.2 million. Fulton County paid out more than $10 million in civil settlements, including $5.2 million to the widow of Judge Barnes and $5 million to the daughter of court reporter Julie Ann Brandow. Brian Nichols is housed in the high maximum unit at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison in Jackson. He lives in permanent solitary confinement. Assistant Corrections Commissioner Tim Ward described Nichols as one of, if not the, most dangerous of Georgia's roughly 53,000 state prisoners, and said the department would ensure Nichols never got out to harm anyone else. Nichols himself acknowledged in an interview that his solitary confinement was justified, saying simply that he had done some very bad things. Nichols killed 4 people in 26 hours and paralyzed a city, but the crimes on this list reach further back than 2005. The next case stretches into the mid-1980s, when a killer stalked Atlanta's streets for nearly a year before a single detective thought to connect the bodies. Michael Terry. Between December of 1985 and November of 1986, 6 gay black men were murdered in Atlanta. Each was stabbed or shot after being lured to an isolated location. Several were found partially undressed, and for 11 months, the killings were treated as separate, unrelated cases. Michael Devon Terry was born in 1960 in Tallahassee, Alabama. He moved to the Atlanta area and established a routine that investigators would later reconstruct in disturbing detail. Terry would position himself near Georgia Baptist Hospital and along Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, areas where men he referred to as street hustlers would approach looking for paid sexual encounters. He would agree to go somewhere private with them. And once they were alone, once there were no witnesses and no one to intervene, he would kill them and take whatever money or valuables they carried. The first confirmed victim was Richard Williams, 24 years old. His body was found on December 6, 1985, at 867 Mason Turner Road. He had been stabbed to death. Over the following 11 months, Curtis Brown, George Willingham, and 3 other men were killed under strikingly similar circumstances. The victims varied in age, but they shared a common vulnerability. They were gay. They were black. They were seeking encounters in areas with minimal law enforcement presence, and they placed their trust in someone who was hunting them. If you had asked Atlanta homicide detectives in the middle of 1986 whether these 6 cases were connected, the answer would have been no. The murders occurred in different parts of the city. Different weapons were involved in different cases. The crime scenes were scattered across neighborhoods. Each killing was investigated in isolation, assigned to different detectives, and each one went cold on its own. Nobody saw the pattern because nobody was looking for one. The breakthrough came from 2 Atlanta police detectives, Sheila Cumberworth and Marcellus Head, who began reviewing unsolved homicides involving similar victim profiles on their own initiative. When they mapped the crime scenes geographically and compared the physical descriptions given by witnesses in the surrounding areas, a consistent picture emerged. Multiple witnesses described a stocky black man who went by the name Mike and had been seen near several of the locations where bodies were recovered. The descriptions were specific enough and consistent enough to build a viable suspect profile, and the trail led investigators to a tire recapping shop in the small town of Lithonia, just east of Atlanta. On November 26, 1986, Michael Terry was arrested at that shop without incident. He was 26 years old. During interrogation, Terry confessed to all 6 murders. He described the locations, the methods, and the circumstances of each killing with a level of detail that matched the physical evidence at every crime scene. He explained how he would meet men in the areas he frequented, how he would agree to go somewhere isolated with them, and how he would attack them once they were alone and vulnerable. Then, before trial, he took it all back. He recanted every word and told the court that all 6 killings were acts of self-defense, claiming that arguments over payment for sexual encounters had turned violent and that he had simply protected himself each time. The prosecution dismantled that defense at trial. They pointed out that multiple victims had been attacked from behind or while in compromising positions, that several had been found nude from the waist down, and that the consistent pattern of luring, killing, and robbing was present in every single case. This was not a man defending himself 6 separate times over the course of a year. This was a man who had found a hunting ground and a population of victims that nobody was paying attention to. Terry was tried first for the murders of Richard Williams and Curtis Brown. The jury convicted him on both counts, and the judge imposed 2 consecutive life sentences. He was then tried separately for the murder of George Willingham before Justice John Langford, who convicted him and handed down a 3rd consecutive life sentence. Facing the certainty of 3 more trials he could not win, Terry changed course and pleaded guilty to the remaining 3 murders. He received 3 additional consecutive life terms. 6 murders, 6 life sentences, all consecutive. Michael Terry will never leave the custody of the Georgia Department of Corrections. The weight of this case rests not only on the brutality of the killings, but on how long it took for anyone to see the connections between them. 6 men were murdered across nearly a full year, and the pattern was only identified because 2 detectives decided on their own to review cold cases with overlapping victim profiles. The victims were marginalized in every way that mattered in 1980s Atlanta. They were gay, black, poor, and seeking encounters that carried deep social stigma. That meant their deaths generated almost no public pressure and no media urgency. The killing pattern existed from the very first murder. It just required someone willing to see it. There is one final case on this list, and it is the one that carries the most complicated legacy of all. It involves a man who was once one of the defining voices of the American civil rights movement, who spent over 2 decades in prison for killing a law enforcement officer, and whose conviction remains contested to this day. Jamil Abdullah al-Amin. Before he was Jamil Abdullah al-Amin, he was H. Rap Brown, the fifth chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a central voice of the Black Power era. The man who stood in front of cameras in the 1960s and told America that violence was as American as cherry pie. Hubert Gerald Brown was born on October 4, 1943, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. By his mid-20s, he was leading SNCC, one of the most important organizations of the civil rights movement. He briefly served as the Black Panther Party's Minister of Justice and became a fixture on FBI surveillance lists during the height of COINTELPRO. In 1971, following a robbery and shootout in Manhattan, Brown was convicted and sentenced to prison. He served 5 years at Attica. While incarcerated, he converted to Islam and took the name Jamil Abdullah al-Amin. After his release, al-Amin moved to Atlanta's West End neighborhood and built a completely different life. He opened a community grocery store, became the imam of a local mosque, and established himself as a neighborhood anchor. Residents described him as a stabilizing presence, someone who had traded the politics of revolution for the discipline of faith. For over 2 decades, that was the story. A former radical who had found peace. Then, on the night of March 16, 2000, that story collapsed. Fulton County Sheriff's deputies Ricky Leon Kinchin and Algernon English arrived at al-Amin's West End grocery store to serve a bench warrant. The warrant was straightforward: failure to appear in court on charges from a 1999 traffic stop involving a stolen car and impersonation of a police officer. It was a routine warrant service, the kind deputies handled dozens of times a week. As the 2 deputies approached the storefront, a man standing on the sidewalk opened fire with a .223 caliber rifle. Deputy Kinchin, who was wearing a ballistic vest, was struck in the abdomen and leg where the vest did not cover. As he collapsed to the ground, the shooter stepped closer and fired 3 additional rounds from a 9mm pistol into Kinchin at point-blank range. Deputy English was also hit but survived. From his hospital bed, English identified al-Amin in a photo lineup as the man who had shot them both. Ricky Kinchin died the following day. He was 35 years old. He left behind a family that had expected him to come home from a routine warrant service. Al-Amin was captured 4 days later, on March 20, 2000, in Whitehall, Alabama. He was wearing a bulletproof vest when apprehended, but his body showed no gunshot wounds. That became a significant point of contention, because both deputies stated they had returned fire and believed they hit the shooter. A .223 rifle and 9mm pistol were recovered from nearby woods. Neither weapon carried al-Amin's fingerprints. His car, however, had bullet holes consistent with the rounds fired by the deputies' handguns. The trial began in February of 2002 in Fulton County Superior Court. On March 9th, after approximately 5 hours of deliberation, a jury of 9 black, 2 white, and 1 Hispanic juror convicted al-Amin on all 13 counts, including murder, aggravated assault on a police officer, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Deputy English testified under oath that al-Amin was the man he saw standing on the sidewalk that night, and that al-Amin was the only person he saw fire a weapon. During the penalty phase, the jury rejected the death sentence. The judge imposed life without parole, plus an additional 30 years on the remaining charges. The conviction has been contested from the moment the verdict was read. An incarcerated man named Otis Jackson confessed to the shooting 3 separate times. Jackson's description of the weapons, the ammunition types, and the deputies' positions at the time of the shooting aligned with the physical evidence. His physical description matched what Deputy English had originally reported to investigators in the hours after the attack. A man approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, 170 pounds, with gray eyes. Al-Amin is 6 feet 5 inches tall, with brown eyes. Jackson also bore healed wounds on his body that he said came from the gunfight. He recanted his confession once, then reconfessed in a sworn affidavit. Prosecutors countered that Jackson's ankle monitor records placed him at a different location that night. Al-Amin's defense attorneys argued the ankle monitor data was unreliable. In May of 2004, the Georgia Supreme Court unanimously upheld the conviction. The case continued through the federal appeals system. On July 31, 2019, the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the lead prosecutor's use of a mock cross-examination during closing arguments had violated Al-Amin's Fifth Amendment right not to testify, and that the violation was both serious and repeated. Judge Charles Wilson wrote that the court regretted it could not provide Al-Amin relief in the face of the prosecutorial misconduct that had occurred at his trial, but concluded the error was harmless given the strength of English's identification. Wilson added that a prosecutor's duty is not to win a conviction by any means available, but to ensure that justice will prevail. Al-Amin was initially housed at Georgia State Prison near Reidsville. In August of 2007, Georgia corrections officials transferred him to federal custody, declaring him too high profile for the state system. He spent years at ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado, before being moved to USP Tucson in December of 2015, and then to Federal Medical Center Butner in North Carolina in March of 2025, after his family petitioned for proper medical care. Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin died at FMC Butner on November 23, 2025, at the age of 82. The cause was complications from stage 4 cancer that his attorneys said had gone undertreated for years while he was in federal custody. His lawyer, Mawuli Davis, stated publicly that it had become overwhelmingly clear to their firm that Imam Jamil Al-Amin did not receive a fair trial. He was buried as Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin. He is remembered by some as a civil rights icon who was targeted by a justice system that never forgave him for the 60s. He is remembered by others as a man who murdered a sheriff's deputy during a routine warrant service. Another man confessed to the crime 3 times. The 11th Circuit found prosecutorial misconduct at trial. An extraordinary motion for a new trial was still pending at the time of his death, and the conviction still stands. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.